You're listening to episode number 20 of the Happy Choir podcast. Hola people, I am your host and creator of the Happy Choir podcast, Carlos Cordero, helping you connect with others through choral music. I'm gonna keep this introduction very short because today's episode brings together two artists that are no strangers to each other. Mark Buller, composer, and Leah Lax, writer, created some years ago this evocative choral piece. What is a piece? This evocative choral piece. The best part is that we get to hear them talk about the process from beginning to end, from the very first word that Leah found to the concert on stage. And we're going to actually include in the next part of this episode a recording of the performance that Houston Chamber Choir did on their concert by Local. Houston Chamber Choir just won a Grammy for Best Choral Performance. Woohoo! And I am very excited to bring to you the artists that can talk about the piece and then to hear the piece live. This is going to be wonderful! I just want to quickly remind you that your support is very, very important, and thank you so much for being here and listening to the Happy Choir podcast. Sharing it, leaving a review, or even if you go to Patreon and support us there, everything is valid. And in today's episode, we have two guests that I'm excited to present to you because as a composer, it's important for me to let others know that we can collaborate with living artists, and it's exciting to know that Mark Buller and Leah Lax did a choral work together, and they are here to talk to us about that experience and their experience in both of their arts and in their work as a composer for Mark Buller and Leah Lax as a poet. Hello and welcome to the Happy Choir podcast.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
So I would like to start this conversation about your relationship with music and with choral music. Let's start with Mark.
Yeah, sure. So my relationship with music goes back really to my childhood, I think. My parents always had good music playing. I always gravitated to my favorites. When I was in junior high, I had a paper route, and one really nice benefit was whenever we got someone to sign up, the newspaper would give us Best Buy a gift card. So I always used to run right away. This is back when Best Buy had a huge classical CD collection, and I'd spend hours trying to find just the right CD and then start a little collection that way. As time went on, I got more and more into music and realized, it could be a career. And so, long story short, here we are, I guess.
How wonderful. And Leah, as a writer, do you have an early relationship with music? Is this something that came later to your life?
Well, it came early and late. It fascinates me that for so many people who have a relationship with classical music, it began with those almost proverbial records that parents played all the time at home. My mother always had opera on going on the record player as a child. And of course, when I moved into my teens, I rolled my eyes at it because it was, it wasn't the rock music I was into. But she was a visual artist, and one of her iconic paintings was a painting of an opera singer taking a bow on the stage against a big red curtain and this sort of a shimmering sea of an audience. And I have always felt that was her picture of herself, not as a singer, but as an artist, making her statement in the world. Because she was making her way as a female artist at a time when that was a very difficult thing to do. She trained me to be a visual artist, but I knew I could never be her, and I became a writer who always loved music and an very amateur cellist. But I stumbled, and with a great love of choral music, by the way. I played cello because I felt, and I still play cello because I felt it was the instrument that most, to me, was most like the human voice. And there's something about particularly ensemble vocal work that affects me like nothing else. But I stumbled into a professional relationship with writing. I have a long-time relationship with a literary organization in Houston called Imprint. And when Houston Grand Ópera in 2005 decided that they wanted to commission an opera based on the stories of immigrants and refugees that live in Houston, they went to Imprint and asked for a local writer who might be willing to do that kind of field work. And Imprint recommended me. And I walked into HGO without training, without any training in working in libretti. I got some on-the-ground training and a pretty intensive academic training at the same time.
Amazing.
And found that it's magic to me, because when you write for music, you have to imagine music that has never been written before, that does not yet exist, and yet as a librettist, you have to imagine the music.
That it's so wonderful, and it's true.
The words establish tone, rhythm, the message, the emotional message. When there's a single voice or ensemble, which voices are singing, the words create the whole structure of the music. There are many, many musical elements in it. And that is going to come from the words before the composer uses that as a jumping off point. And I found I could.
That's wonderful. And it's so true. Well, the first thing that I wanted to say is that cello is one of my secret passions, and I've never learned to play, but I just love how much. And it's true. It's one of the instruments that sound so close to the human voice, and it's just so wonderful. So I'm happy to know that you play cello. The other thing is that it is true, and I've never heard this before, of the idea that you have to write the text for a piece that doesn't exist yet, but that you have to imagine the music. That's such an incredible way to think about it. And it's true, because then the composer will spend a lot of time with the text before even setting it to music. I also remember from your website when you talk about the immigrant projects, you say, but my great love is listening to voices other than my own. And that was so incredible for me, because then it speaks of what you do with your projects. And is this something that you think it's because of the human voice, or because of the stories in a metaphorical way?
That's a question that you say as a musician, as a composer, clearly to me, because the magic to me of listening to those voices is when I give them to a composer, I hear the music between the lines. To a composer, music is the language of emotion. And that's what I cannot quite translate into words when I write those stories or transcribe those words, but they're there to me. Those are the lines that are fraught with emotion or shimmering with feeling that I give the composer, and I trust. So it's very metaphorical, but to me, very tangible. And if I get the right composer, the composer will feel it loud and clear, will hear the language that I don't have words for and translate it into music. So it feels to me as if they take my words to a level beyond anything that I can reach.
And I think one interesting thing about collaborations like this, when you have people working in two different media, is that what Leah mentions of that meaning and emotion between the lines, behind the text, yes, can be similar in both parties, but at the same time, you're also bringing out these really minor differences, and it's that kind of counterpoint of ideas that I think really make the finished piece very interesting. And I think it's something that composers who write their own texts in libretti. That's terrific and an admirable quality, and I'm sure saves time. But I feel like it's probably something that they miss out on, I suspect.
I know that it's sometimes my job to open the composer up and say, okay, I see where you're going. I want you to understand where I was going. I want you to feel also what I was feeling so that, to keep the collaboration moving forward. And always the music comes first. Always the music is the primary. I take a vastly secondary role. But yeah, I'm seconding what Mark said, is that I want to add that complexity to where they're going.
I have to say that this is very, very exciting to hear both of you talk about the collaboration, because you're working on it and you're creating the piece and you're letting one or the other collaborate on this to build something from a teamwork. And it is very exciting because, at least as you say, sometimes I write my own text, but it's true. Sometimes we need that other person that has a different view and that has, for example, here Leah brings her own artistry. Mark, you bring your own artistry, and then you create something together. It's something different than just doing it by yourself.
Sure.
Do you feel that it's challenging to create in this way? It's something that you had to learn or that you felt comfortable doing?
Yeah, I think it's something we definitely have to learn. In our culture, at least, and certainly in Western music, I feel like we have this cult of the individual that we've had since since the Enlightenment, probably, where we put up on a pedestal this single person who creates this great work of art, the capital G and a capital A, right? Where, the tortured genius goes into his cave or chambers or whatever, and out comes this completely polished piece. And we forget how important collaboration is. Certainly in education and in the corporate world, in the last few decades at least, we've pretended to, I should say, make overtures to getting better at collaboration, but it hasn't affected really a sea change yet, I feel. And so, the first time you work with someone, you're not used to that at all. My first major collaboration was my first opera with Charles Anthony Silvestri, The Pastry Prince. We've written 4 now.
Amazing.
But trying to figure out, who does what. And it was his first opera too. So it was great because we could go into it, figuring it out as we go along, I guess. But it's really fascinating. And you learn a lot about collaboration. You learn, oh my goodness, so much about the creative process, because I think in part, for the first time, you don't just create and it happens, right? You create and you have to be cognizant about how and what you are creating. And then additionally, you have to be very flexible so that when you come out on the other side of creation, what you have isn't this sort of golden calf that can't change. It has to be something that can flex and can take into account the other person's ideas as well.
I would second that with Mark. I didn't come to it naturally. I tried to, in my first work, I tried to imagine everything from the staging, from the staging to the shape of the music to everything. And a vocal work is one of the most humbling and wonderfully humbling, I think, of musical forms, because no one part of it is primary. It's ultimately, if you get that humility before the collaborative process, it comes out a beautiful synthesis between the composer and the librettist and the vocalists. They have to have the space to bring their art to the stage and not be dictated to as well.
Certainly.
Did you feel at any point some kind of pressure that, for example, in writing the text that the composer had to set to music, or writing the music that the poet or the writer had previously written?
Pressure, yes. I don't know if it's where the source of that is, generally myself, because you want to do a good job for the sake of doing a good job. You want to do a good job for the commissioners, and you want to do a good job to honor the hard work that your collaborator has put into the piece. Leah sent me the text to our fairly significant, I should say, in terms of forces and rehearsal time, the piece we did together. And I did my normal process where I try to live with the piece for a while. I try to inhabit the same sort of space that she did, mentally and creatively. Like she said before, like she alluded to, I tried to read the emotion between the lines, but it's a 3-movement piece. And honestly, like in the second movement, the emotion I read was a little bit different than she'd intended.
That's right.
So yeah, we had a meeting where she'd seen kind of this dry humor where I had seen more of an elegiac tone. And so we had a really good meeting where we said, she said, here's my truth. And I said, okay, here's mine. And we figured out where a good kind of in-between place was.
But when I come across a situation like that, the composer always wins.
That's not fair.
I think it was... We're probably getting ahead of ourselves, but the piece we wrote together was called Overboard, and I'll let Leah tell about the story. But the second movement deals with the experiences of prisoners of war after they get home. They drank their tea extremely hot and so on, and didn't care for rice. And Leah, I think you said, it's been 4 years now, but I think you said you'd heard it almost more as a waltz.
Or it wasn't a waltz, but I certainly wanted it at a quicker tempo. Mm-hmm. I actually wrote, you could hear the bounce in the words. They drank their tea extremely hot, didn't care for rice. And I heard it at a quicker tempo. And Mark pushed back, and I went, and he said, you got to think about the ability of a chorus to sing this too.
Certainly an unaccompanied chorus, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I love these details.
And so, I mean, my first idea too had been this very slow, expansive sort of thing. But you know what? I realized through her explaining what she'd meant by that, I realized, yeah, we do have to speed it up. So, I mean, I changed the tempo marking. I changed some of the phrase structure. I changed some of the rests. I worked a lot on bringing out some of that text rhythm that she had very ingeniously written into that. And I think, honestly, in the large scale of the piece, I think it makes so much more sense taking that into account, because it's a really good contrast with the movements on either side of it.
And I have to say that also having writers like Leah who are willing to speak up and to explain their process, and even more important that, you're here with us. You're not 1700 poem, but you wrote this poem for this commission, and the fact that there is an opinion to countering, it's amazing. It's something that I'm glad that it's valued. I'm glad that it went through the process, because then the piece becomes something different, becomes something that was envisioned that way, but also added these details. It's amazing to hear from the process.
Oh, believe me, the first time I pushed back with a composer, I was terrified. But by the time Mark came along, I wasn't.
It's amazing.
So I was more like, now, Mark.
Do you feel you had the right to do it, or do you feel that you must do it?
At that point, I had a deep respect for the collaborative process. And it's not a collaboration unless you both come to the table, trust one another, and speak to one another. At that point, I knew that if I didn't speak, I wasn't an honorable part of the collaboration.
And I think there's something too, as collaborations go forward, and Leah and I have been scheming for our next, but I know with my 4 collaborations now with Tony Silvestri, he's told me, he thinks of my style when he writes, which is terrific, and it's great. And he knows kind of something that blew me away. He knows when I'm going to go for a high note. And so for singers, he's very careful to keep, an open vowel that a singer doesn't have to modify much on. And it's things like that really make it interesting. It's the same as writing for a specific person or for your audience. It's the same as knowing your choir, as a conductor, knowing your choir. And even before you go into the first rehearsal, knowing the vowel they're going to struggle with, knowing the harmony that you're going to have to isolate, right? Knowing the section you're going to have to give a stern look to.
Well, some composers have tics.
That's true.
I love
There
this.
are certain words that they will just hit a high note on and hold.
Mhm.
Like, you know, in the first piece I wrote, it was a composite of quotes from many different people. And because they had been through many different things, they often would refer to their religious faith. And I knew that anytime I wrote the word God, the composer was going to hit the highest note possible. But eventually I had to sit him down.
That's wonderful. And it's such a process that I feel both artists grow together. And as you say, Mark, you get to learn from each other
Mhm.
when to expect that something is going to happen or something is going to go on one way. And that's beautiful because
Mhm.
then once you get to work together, even if it's just for a project, for one project, with every time that you meet, then you start to create this closeness and the piece benefits from this.
Sure, absolutely. Think of an actor. You know, if an actor um, only ever collaborates with one director, they could be good, but they're going to be working really in one style. But if someone has worked with all sorts of directors from all around the world, they're going to be much more well-rounded.
Something also amazing that I've discovered researching with both of your career is that, and from this conversation, is that we haven't talked much about choral music, but it has so much to do with choral music, what we're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
that I just love how important and relevant this openness to new things is.
Sure.
And both of you have an extensive career in opera, writing for writing librettos, writing the music for opera, and it's exciting how you bring this then to your collaboration with Overboard, as you've mentioned. This piece was commissioned from Houston Grand Ópera. Can you tell us a little bit more about this project?
I'll let Leah tell about the genesis because she did a really deep dive before I did.
Before I begin, I want to say that there is nothing from me having not expected to wind up writing libretti and working with composers of the caliber of Mark. Going about my business and the phone rings and it's the composer saying, I just completed this section and I want to know what you think. And then I will be the first one in the world to hear the music. And yet, having come to a point where I can say, okay, I'll tell you what I think, and actually, being able to give that feedback, it's just, to me, it's the height of a collaborative process. I've even had composers write me and call me and play for me and say, when you wrote the words, is this how you felt? And then they'll play the music.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Overboard. Okay, Houston Grand Ópera has a community outreach branch called HCO for community, and they wanted to reach out to veterans. Their Veterans Songbook project was an ongoing project. Mark wrote a number of songs for it, and they decided to perform them in a program and culminate in one large choral piece. And that's how Overboard started. Now I have to tell you a quick story that's the true background of this. Way back on March 1st of 1942, just as World War II was beginning, in the Sunda Strait off of what is now Jakarta, Japanese warships attacked the USS Houston. Now, what happened was that there was an Asiatic fleet. We had, this is about a week after, right? No, this is just, help me, Mark. When was Pearl Harbor? Was it just before that
December 7th, 1941. So this isn't
right.
even 4 months later.
Yeah, this is not even 3 months later. We had just gone into the war. We were not prepared. We went in with an aging and not very big naval fleet, but we already had a fleet there in the Asiatic Sea because there was a consortium of several different countries protecting what at that point were British colonial interests in Asia. And the USS Houston was the flagship of the Asiatic fleet. It was the pride of Houston. I mean, the pride of the American fleet. And they went through battles. The USS Houston went through 3 battles in 3 days. It was heavily damaged. They had pulled into port somewhere in Australia. They were being sent home. The guys on board had not slept in more than 48 hours. The ship was heavily damaged. So American intelligence told them, go through the Sunda Strait at midnight when it's completely black and nobody can see you. That will be your route home for shore leave and repairs. The same thing had just happened to another ship in the same fleet, the HMS Perth from Australia. The 2 ships were going through the Sunda Strait in the middle of the night, completely black. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And U.S. intelligence missed the fact that a very new and very powerful Japanese fleet was assembling right there that night because they were going to invade what is now Jakarta the next morning. So these 2 ships sailed directly into them. They had to throw big searchlights to be able to conduct the battle, which went on and off and on and off from the different ships as they shot at each other. The Japanese fired on the USS Houston at such close range that the missiles went all the way through the ship and sunk 2 Japanese ships directly on the other side of them. They sank their own ships. The battle lasted about an hour and both ships went down. About 1,500 young men of the 2 crews went down. That was about 2/3. The rest of the guys clung to debris through the night, and the next morning, Japanese small boats went through and picked up the lucky ones. The rest were left to their devices in the water. And these survivors were taken to very awful jungle POW camps. A number of them were from Houston. Now, what happened after that is that they were left in those camps for the duration of the war. And these guys from Houston and Australia bonded with one another and helped one another survive. They were forgotten here, completely forgotten about. It was a very early loss. So there's the double thing, that it was early and it was a loss. And in both cases, people wanted to forget. They came straggling back when the war was over. Years later, the survivors in Houston, some of who stayed bonded to one another, contacted their old buddies in Australia who started coming to Houston on the anniversary of the battle. They'd meet in like a Howard Johnson's and drink beer and remember. And this became a tradition that stayed for a long time. Eventually, this annual reunion, somebody at City Hall heard about it, and it started becoming an official part of the city calendar. By the time I went to one of these reunions, the mayor came, membership from the USS Navy Admiralty flew in from Washington. There was a color guard. It's a whole ceremony. The city eventually sent divers to the Jakarta Strait, and they brought up the ship Bell that is now ensconced in Liberty Park across from City Hall, and that's the site of this commemoration, which still happens every year on March 1. And that is why, to this day, Perth is a sister city for the city of Houston, with ongoing relationships between the two cities, but because of the bond between these guys who have all died at this point, and the next generation is carrying on, and the city and the Navy is carrying on this annual commemoration. They just said, there was this battle, we want you to commemorate it. It's part of our Veterans Project. There was a long silence between us. I said, I'm an artist. You cannot ask me to make art that commemorates war. I can't do that. I have to feel it. I have to support it, or it won't be any good. I can't do that. She said nothing. And then there was another long silence. And I said, wait a minute. You've commissioned my work before. You know me. You knew who you were calling. Because what I do is I don't commemorate events. I use people's voices. I listen to the people who experienced it. Well, what came after that was a deep dive into military history, into the story. I gave you a very tiny overview just now. And then I found a couple of books written about the event, et cetera. But I also found videotapes of survivors from Australia, from U.S., survivors from the British ship that went down, Japanese survivors that were, with subtitles so I could understand what they were saying. And I could see their faces and hear them speak. The voices to me are like music. I don't see much difference between speaking and choral music. And I built a great deal of the libretto that I wrote from their actual words. They were young guys. A lot of them were farm boys who had no experience in the world. Their military was their first experience. They have a camaraderie on board that they idealized. They were taught to idealize, and it all blew away. And they struggled afterwards to live a life because people come back from war damaged. And that became the truth of a libretto that I could write.
And it's amazing to see how you received this idea and then you found a way to tell the stories that you felt you could connect with in your art and the way that you do your text.
Well, when you listen to real people tell their own stories, when I do, every time I go, I couldn't have made this up.
Hey people, I want to take a quick second to tell you how your support makes a difference. When you support me on patreon.com, you are not only giving $3 a month, but you are giving my brand a vote of confidence. This translates to helping several other artists to connect through choral music. Think about it as a cup of coffee that you invite me once a month. Only that is way more impactful and personal. Plus you get to be part of the behind the scenes of my career as a composer, with the many perks that I shared in there. Even if you're not able to give right now, your support listening to this podcast is great, even more if you leave a review in iTunes. Patreon.com/ComposerCordero is the link that you want to visit or share with others. Hope to see you there. Exactly, and seeing those videos and the reactions, I love how you not only hear the words, but see the faces and hear the inflections of the voice to find the things that you want to include in the text. It's really amazing and very powerful to hear the process behind the text, because sometimes as audience we can get to a concert and see a program because I love text and I'm a big choral nerd that I'm always researching how did this happen and why did they choose these words and etc. But sometimes people can just think, oh, this is a text that was written for this piece, and there's so much history behind.
There's so much trust involved on the part of the composer because to write for music, you get very, very, very few words, 3-word lines, 4-word lines. I just want to give you one example. These guys, some of them died in the POW camp because they didn't have shoes, because they were in the jungle. Many of them got infections through their feet, and then they couldn't control the infections. I'm just going to read you 30 words, very brief, from the first movement. And the last sentence that starts with "He died on my app" is a quote from a man who talked about spending the night on a raft with his buddy not a raft, holding onto a piece of, like being able to sit on a piece of debris with his buddy who'd been wounded. We were cogs in a machine, brothers in brotherhood. When the Houston rolled over, she took our shoes. He died on my lap on a raft on the sea. I eased him overboard. It's so brief. It's so cryptic, but Mark heard it. And when you hear Mark's music for these two sections, people tear up. He got it. He understood what a tragedy it was that she took our shoes, or what it is to sit on a raft with your buddy in life and he dies in your arms. Mark got it. I mean, it's in the music. This has been performed now, what is it, 4 times or 5 times, Mark, in Houston?
4 times, I think. Yeah.
The first time, there was a lot of military brass there. And I'm a very small person, and I think they invited particularly tall people that day. Nobody knew who I was, which was great, standing in the crowd as Mark was conducting the original performance, because I was watching all that military brass. I watched guys wiping their eyes. It was really something.
Leah, you mentioned the kind of the drama inherent in the text, and I think that's where it's important for us composers not to silo ourselves. And goodness, the same goes for performers, conductors, everybody. Having that experience, writing art song, but especially writing dramatic vocal pieces, I think really came in handy here, because if I had approached this the way, compositionally, the way I would before I wrote the operas, I would have, I don't know, my compositional tool chest at that point had, anthems and motets, which, I mean, would have turned out a very different piece. So I think it's, we both on the creative side and the performer side, I think it's really important always to be thinking of the drama, right? If we were staging this and not just standing on risers, how does that change the performance?
I love that idea, because then it's not just a choral piece, but it's a piece of music. It's and I'm not saying that just a choral piece as a bad thing, but it is as a dramatic work that unfolds on stage. It becomes an experience for the audience, and that's just wonderful when it happens. It's amazing to hear this story of how you two took these interviews and story and brought it to stage. Leah, when you complete the text, what was the first encounter that you had with Mark? Was it a discussion about the text, or did you just send him the text and he was free to write music?
Mark, do you remember?
I think we had a couple of phone calls about the piece itself. I can't remember. I don't think HGO kind of had looped us in as far as meetings yet.
No, because they hired us separately, and so I submitted the text, and it kind of went through the channels until the HGO artistic director approved it. He wrote me. Patrick Summers wrote me, and I remember that because he said, "This is beautiful, Leah." Mm-hmm. And then it was forwarded to Mark, and Mark had time to sort of absorb it before we spoke.
Mm-hmm. I should note too that originally, back when we first had this discussion with HGO, they had asked for something that could potentially be sung by an amateur choir of veterans, something that didn't exist at the time, but that the company would put together. Soon thereafter, as we were working on it, there was a change of leadership at the company.
That never happened.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, when I got the text and when I realized the scope and when I realized what it had to do, as well as the power that was in that text, this is going to sound, I don't mean to say that an amateur choir wouldn't be able to handle that, but if if I could write for professionals, I knew that I could wring a lot more out of that text, which again was there. It just had to be mined. And so, fortunately, when the new and current director of HGOCO came in, she and I had a long phone talk as she was, jumping midway into a lot of these projects, which already had that energy going forward and that momentum. And at that point, I said, I hadn't written a note yet. I had been studying the text and the history. And I asked her and said, this amateur course is a brilliant idea for the sake of logistics as well as, the tone of the piece. What would you think about 12 or 16 singers from the HGO kind of company circle? And fortunately, she agreed to that, and that's how the piece went forward. And honestly, that's how I could dive a little bit deeper into kind of the drama of the piece, if that makes any sense.
It totally makes sense, because then you have different tools to work with to bring the drama of the work that you knew as you were studying the text were there.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. It was all there too, and that Patrick was right in that amazing text. It just was waiting to be mined.
I have to say that recently Houston Chamber Choir performed this work, and about a week later, they received a Grammy for a different work, for a recording of a different work, not ours. But that was the caliber of the choir at their height when they performed Overboard. And when they started to sing, I was overwhelmed. I mean, just totally humbled by it. I turned to Mark, my jaw dropped, and I said, "Did we know? I don't think we knew."
I think the great thing is creative people, and we all know this, choir members, conductors know this. There comes a point at which, when you've done your job and you're done and you've handed it off to somebody else and you trust in their artistry and you've nurtured that artistry, your ego is just, as an artist, is completely gone. And, well, ideally, not always, but, and the piece kind of,
for various reasons,
it's going to sound very new agey. It becomes like a living being on its own, to where I don't know. I don't have any kids, but I imagine it's like seeing your kids grow up, right? It's someone else's, like in this instance, the Houston Chamber Choir made it their own piece, and it wasn't mine anymore. And that was really a cool thing.
And they were invested when they finished it. Those rare performances where there's sort of a stunned silence for, 10 seconds or maybe 5 seconds or so before they start to clap. It was kind of like that. I think it resonates in Houston because it is a Houston story, and full of, it's that humility Mark was talking about. It's like, to stand back and let the survivors actually talk in the song, to let the music stand back and let the performers feel it and take off with it where they will. There are very various elements in any collaboration beyond just the two of us.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because one of the questions that I had was this exactly recent concert that Houston Chamber Choir did with your piece in the Bilocal, I think it was, right? The name of the concert. Right. And it's great that the piece is having so many other performances, because then you start to see how it evolves with every performance, and now it's out there, and you cannot control what's happening with it. As you say, it's like your children growing up, but it's amazing that the story is being told and that the choir and the audience is being exposed to this wonderful thing that you've created together.
And it's a difficult piece. It's not easy to put together. I think hopefully it's written sensibly so that it's totally possible. But at the same time, I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about the role of difficult music in any performer's repertoire. There are some topics that I think are only done justice when they're told through this difficult lens. And when it comes to this telling the stories of these people who fought and died and suffered and who rebuilt their lives gloriously, right? And what's more, when you do it in their own words, it would be glib to do it in a way that someone could put together in 10 seconds and sight read, right? I feel like it is our duty as composers and performers to, we'll never mirror their experience, but I feel like the best way for us to respect what they went through and what they did is for us to work at it a little bit, to tell their story in a way that is at least somewhat difficult for us as well.
And it makes you also be invest in the story and the journey that this took to. Well, first of all, it's an experience. As you said, you're not going to live the same experience, but you're going to have the time with the piece to process all of this.
Right. And you need time. It's not something that you can just look at, read through, and be done. It is something where you do need to kind of thoughtfully look back.
I just want to quickly remind you that all of the links that are mentioned in this episode will be in the show notes in thehappychoir.com/podcast, or find it in the description of this episode. Also, once you are there in the website, you can subscribe to the newsletter. This will come with a $20 discount for your next choral recording, a free guide that I've created just for you on the things that I've discovered in my career on how to be a happy composer, conductor, or singer. You will also receive a weekly email with podcast episodes, blog posts, and music. I hope to see you there. Now, let's get back to this episode. This might be a question that you might not be able to answer, but was the decision of doing it for choir previously decided by HCO, or did you have any say on this?
No, that was all completely decided by them. Which, they don't do a lot. They, of course, do opera. They do a lot of art song. I don't really think they had done choral much before. I think this was intended to cap off the multi-year veteran songbook project, for which they had commissioned several dozen art songs. But this was kind of like the everything coming together final cap on that project.
I also feel it's beautiful for an opera company to commission new choral works, because then it breaks that barrier, and it's just wonderful that it not only created a new work that we can listen to in concerts, but that it brought both of you together.
Absolutely. And you know what? Props to them, number one, for going local. There are so many composers all around the world who would do such an amazing job with this, but props to the company for keeping everything Houston-based. I really appreciate that sort of buy local mentality. Same to the Houston Chamber Choir. You mentioned the buy local concert. How important it is to look in our own backyards, I think, for this collaboration, which takes collaboration beyond the performance side beyond the creation side into the realm of performance. It adds yet another dimension to this collaboration.
And I love that buy local in this case was buy local artists, but it also was a local story told by the people, the Houstonians that survived, that experienced it. There were so many different levels to that. Just the name of the concert for the performance of this work. I'd like to add just a word about the final movement. As a word person, I'm always aware of how much you can't say with words, and how working with music is always an opportunity to get the words out of the way, to keep each word saying enough that it doesn't need two more to finish what the one word needs to say. When it came to the story of these men in the actual POW camps, I decided that wasn't the story we could tell at all. And we skipped right over to, a little bit about their life after the camp. And I felt that the struggle that you heard in that told you what they went through, because you saw the damage. But at the end, the last movement is basically in memoriam. And what do you say? As much as I had no words for what they had suffered in the camps, how much more so there's no words that encompass their death and the effort to memorialize them. And I kept getting the image. I had recently walked through the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., which is two walls that are black slabs of highly polished marble or granite with the names simply etched in them. And they're etched one after the other, exact same size and spacing, so that there's a rhythm to them as you walk. You walk between these two walls of names. They go on and on. There's something like 46,000 names etched there. And all you can see besides that is a narrow swath of clouds or sky above you. So I decided that I could not write a memoriam to them, but I could say their names. And I called Mark about it because I wrote just a list of, I picked at random from the alphabet. I went through the alphabet and alternated between the crew lists of the Australian and Houston ships, because in my mind, if it was an acrostic, the A name would represent all the A names, and the B all the B's. In a way, this was a shortened way to encompass them all.
Yeah.
And then I ended the piece not on my words because I had no words, but on a quote from one of the survivors who said, "Now I don't know if I'm the survivor or the fallen." And Mark chose to set this as an aleatoric. Mark, you want to explain?
Yeah, so I mean, it's just such a brilliant idea of Leah. And I think it's important for all of us to get this concept of getting out of our own way, right, and just letting it happen. She mentioned the Vietnam memorial, I think, too, of Flanders Field, right? It's just row on row of the, just names. And it's almost the, you mentioned not trivializing war by, bringing out the band and doing a big parade. You think of Siegfried Sassoon when you have this almost silent protest, right, of just the names. I mean, really, it's a topic that has been written to death. There's nothing that we can write that musically or textually that 1,000 other people have said before. So it's these names. They don't just customize it. They make it so powerful. So, yeah, so I had this list of names in front of me. There's so much power in there. What do you do with it? I knew I couldn't set it traditionally. I couldn't have someone just conduct their way through the names. Then it's just a list, right?
He caught the way they echo. That's what he caught.
Mm-hmm. I thought about the names and the people they represented, and I thought about, what were their last thoughts? Well, it's these names of people who are, sinking beneath the waves, both literally and metaphorically, as we get further and further removed, all of the details of them, all the details that are remembered about them, their favorite story, what they ate for breakfast, their favorite vacation, all this stuff was being forgotten, was being swallowed up into this sort of sea of unknowing that happens to all of us. And so it's this idea of a sea that really stuck with me. We start the first movement with the flash of the large guns and water everywhere, walls of water. Leah wrote water walls, flash and fire. And I thought about how over the course of this entire piece, we've seen large scale, disturbed, angry waters gradually, like memory, become flat, right? And so I thought, well, why not create this aural texture of just the names, where the names themselves, the names are the waves themselves. So we hear the four sections of the choir enter one at a time, singing each name on a set of notes, one or four notes, over and over in their own time.
That's the thing, is that each one of the singers then is given this freedom to feel the music and to repeat their little piece at their own will, as often or as few times as they want, as quickly or as slowly. And they get lost. They almost depart from the group and get lost in their own circle of the name that they're singing. And the music ebbs and flows, and it echoes. The names echo as the music is proceeding. I Mark had to tell me what an aleatoric is. I didn't know.
We had a
And
Greek lesson that day.
Yeah, I was blown away. And then finally, when you're so lost in this as a listener, these waves washing over you and the names, and you see the facial changes on the vocalists because they're deeply affected by it. Then one lone, I think it's a tenor, I don't know, sings over the top of it. I don't know, alto. I don't know if I'm the survivor or the fallen. And
even before that, thinking dramatically, I don't know, I had to have this Hegelian synthesis, right? Like, what's the point of all this? And so, again, drawing on some of those dramatic vocal writing roots, I thought, well, what is it? What melody? What's most powerful to these people? What is it that, as a group of people together, helps us keep their memory alive? And I thought of course, the Navy itself, but also the Navy hymn. And so after we kind of reach a climax with all the names, they ebb back down. And then as the names are continuing, we hear over top of this aleatoric texture, one voice sing just wordless. This is a vocalese, basically. The first line of the Navy hymn.
Oh, I didn't know.
More join. Oh, yeah. It's the Navy hymn. To those in peril on the sea. So one by one they enter until it's about half and half. I think I wrote it a third and 2/3 to get the balance right. Technically, not to ring my own bell or whatever, it was really tricky. I hadn't done anything like that before, right? Superimposing this a strict meter, which you have to have when everyone's singing the hymn together, with this aleatoric thing. And it was hard to do, but I think it worked in the end. And then at the very end, I thought, well, Leah had mentioned to me several times about how she was struck in one of the recordings by the ringing of the ship's bell, and how over the top of all of this sea of voices that she'd heard recounting their stories, it was the clarion bell that had really stunned her. And so I thought, well, why not? So at the end of the piece, as the names are fading off, I wrote in there optional, ring a bell, and then we have kind of this dovetailed crossfade, where as the bell gets louder, the voices drop out until we're left with just the bell ringing. For the third performance, which was at this ceremony at the park, it was really fascinating because what do we see right in front of us but that bell that Leah mentioned earlier? And so we're all ready to go. We're all set to go. We were going to do it without a bell because we didn't have one. And then there it is. And so Leah came up and said, I'm going to ask if I can ring that bell. And sure enough, and I'll tell you what, hearing the very bell of the USS Houston performed against the names of the people who were on that ship was an unbelievable experience.
Overwhelming.
Would move the most hardened pacifist.
I mean, it's like making the connection, the perfect connection then in that moment.
It was full circle.
And it is so inspiring to hear all of these details that then come to the piece, and to find the ways that we can do that, just because there's one way that we can write music and it can be all cold and say, oh yeah, I'm going to do all of this, and this plus this will make a piece. That's all. But to add the human side, and to add the emotions and these details of what we feel, what we hear, what we know about the story, because as you said, you did your research and you care for this story and for these people. So there was no way of not including all of this, that your heart, your mind, your creativity was telling you. It's just amazing. And I just hope, and of course, all of this will be in the show notes and for people to be able to listen to this. But I just hope that we're all able to listen to it live, because it is really a life-changing experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What is the thing that you wish for composers and writers that are looking to work together to create a new piece of choral music to know or to do?
I'd say be confident in your own voice and your own craft, but be humble with what you've created, knowing it is a shared result, really. Be this a willingness to change what you've created, I think is very important.
And I'd say take the leap to imagine the other person's process as you write.
And do you feel? I think that there are a lot of people that don't know that this can happen. Composers that are too shy to approach poets. What would you say to them?
I'd say don't quit your day job. And I would say that this is an art form that is so unlike anything else that if you have the opportunity, do it, because you will never be the same as an artist, regardless of where it goes, certainly regardless of what it pays you. Don't quit your day job and don't pass the opportunity.
I think we're so siloed,
When you say that, Mark, you mean so sort of pigeonholed in one.
Yeah, we all work in our own fields, and we spend all of our time with people who are just like us. And I think getting outside of that paradigm is so incredibly important. Some of my most fulfilling experiences as a composer have been talking with people who work in other disciplines. I had a couple of years ago at an artist colony in Georgia, I had a bunch of really great conversations with someone who weaves with Icelandic horsehair. And, which is brilliant, because once you get past the kind of the barriers, you realize you have this lingua franca, right? We speak the same language, just with different dialects, and it's so fascinating. Leah and I have really amazing conversations because we're doing the same thing, we're chipping away at the same boulder from different sides.
Absolutely. In the Hebrew language, the word for poem and the word for song are virtually the same word. The only difference is a vowel that is basically the letter H. It's just air. It has the words have the same root, and they're virtually pronounced the same. And I'm always aware that in other cultures, poetry is something that is always assumed it's verbal and vocal. It's not just to be read alone. In Russia, poets wrote poetry only to be stood, only to be declaimed, only to be pronounced aloud. They were It was like a performance art. I think the crossover thing is essential for writers, particularly because we need to get out of our heads and out of words, so that we can engage directly with the real world, to listen, to see, to feel, to smell, so that we have a vocabulary to translate into words.
Amazing. Is there any announcement that you want to share with us?
I wish.
I know Leah has some great things on the horizon, so everyone should follow her professional Facebook page for when those happen.
As you do, Mark.
Some interesting things on the horizon. I've got this summer 2020, Houston Grand Ópera has commissioned me for a pastiche opera for high school students. So again, Tony Silvestri and I have written a really fun opera that pulls in all the famous arias and choruses and ensembles and the occasional recit that we've tamed for high school voices and somehow shoehorned into the Wizard of Oz, and it is so much fun, and I'm looking forward to that.
This is great.
Wonderful.
I'm completing a book called Not From Here that is the story of my experience listening to immigrants and refugees tell me their stories, Houstonians, and what a transformative experience it was for me personally. It's a memoir. I'm completing that, and I'm also working on a couple of other, one in particular, but a couple of other opera projects that are pretty exciting right now. But until I have a signed contract on the table, I'm not making an announcement.
Exactly. I love it. And of course, all of this will be in the show notes and where people can find you online to keep up with these projects. So I'm excited to keep learning more about your endeavors as an artist out there, both in music and in words. So thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to us in the Happy Choir podcast.
Sure thing. Thanks for having us, Carlos.
It was great fun. Thank you, Carlos.
See you in the next episode of the Happy Choir podcast. Ciao, people. You've been listening to the Happy Choir podcast. For more information and show notes, visit thehappychoir.com. You are listening to part 2 of episode number 20 of the Happy Choir podcast. Hola people, I am Carlos Cordero, host and creator of the Happy Choir podcast, helping you connect with others through choral music. I hope that you are tuning in from the part 1 of this episode, where Mark Buller and Leah Lax explain everything about this piece that we're about to listen. The Grammy-winning Houston Chamber Choir, conducted by Robert Simpson, gave a thrilling performance of this piece last year in their concert by Local, and I'm so grateful to them for providing us with this recording. You are in for a wonderful performance. Just before we listen to this, I want to quickly remind you the ways that you can support the Happy Choir podcast. You can share it with your favorite person out there or with everybody. You can also leave a review in iTunes, or you can go to patreon.com/composercordero, and for as little as $3 a month, you can help keep this show running. Now, here's the Houston Chamber Choir performing Overboard.
50 caliber, 5-inch, 8-inch, 1-point rounds.
Remember that if you want to learn more about the process of how Mark Buller and Leah Lax wrote this piece and all about the commission from the Houston Grand Ópera, go to episode 20 of the Happy Choir podcast and you can learn all about that and tips for collaborating with other artists. Thank you so much for being here and see you in the next episode of the Happy Choir podcast. Ciao, people! Woohoo! You've been listening to the Happy Choir podcast. For more information and show notes, visit thehappychoir.com.